Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment of Border 100, brought to you by Louth County Library Service. I'm joined this evening by Dr. Colin Reid of Sheffield University. Colin is the author of a book called The Lost Ireland of Stephen Gwyn, and he's an expert on the Irish Parliamentary Party, and he's going to talk to us tonight about constitutional nationalism and partition. He's been recently working on other topics such as 19th century political thought in Ireland, but it's good to get him here to talk to us today and to return to something that's been of interest to him and to me and to many of us. As I said when I was promoting this talk on social media, Louth was the Irish Parliamentary Party's best county in terms of vote share in 1918. So I'm sure we have at least some people who are still interested in that history joining us tonight, and it's good to see another great expert on this area, Felix Larkin, in the audience. So welcome, Felix. And over to you, Colin.
Thanks very much, Tommy. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I'm going to try and share a screen. I hope this goes smoothly. So just, Tommy, let me know if this doesn't work out properly. Hopefully this will work. If I do this. There. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Hopefully, yeah, perfect. Excellent. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. Well, when I was asked to give this lecture by Tommy, initially the topic was listed as Irish Parliamentary Party and United Irish League opposition to partition. Now, when I was thinking about it, I thought this is actually a very difficult lecture to give. The Irish Parliamentary Party, as we know, was obliterated at the general election of 1918, returning only 6 MPs in Ireland, or 7 if we include T.P. O'Connor, the MP for Liverpool. After some deliberation, those MPs opted to attend Westminster rather than the underground Dáil Éireann. The UIL, the United Irish League, which was in effect the grassroots body of the Irish Party in Ireland, became moribund during the First World War, with many branches virtually extinguished by 1916. So Irish Party and UIL opposition to partition was weak because the respective organisations barely existed in 1920. The 7 Irish nationalist MPs at Westminster were vocal in their hostility to the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which partitioned Ireland, but they obviously lacked the numbers of the old Parnellite and Redmondite parties to truly make a difference. So while the Irish Party and the UIL were largely defunct by 1920, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that Home Rulers were completely marginal to the events surrounding partition. There was a conglomeration of political forces broadly identifiable as constitutional nationalists active in the debate over partition. And what I want to do today here is just think a little bit about several different strands of constitutional nationalism and their attitudes to partition. And we'll find that these attitudes turn out to be more varied than you would initially think. So as we know, the general election of 1918 provided Sinn Féin with a significant electoral mandate to abstain from Westminster and establish Dáil Éireann. The great loser of the election of 1918 was, of course, the Irish Parliamentary Party. But even with its local organisation in terminal decline during the First World War, the IPP still managed to win 1/5 of the votes cast in 1918, and indeed polled credibly in certain areas, as Tommy's even mentioned, polling well in Louth. So, but given there was a large number of uncontested constituencies in 1918, the 220,837 Irish Party votes cast implied the constitutional nationalism perhaps still had a political base in Ireland, albeit a scattered and demoralised one, despite the obliteration of the National Party. So what I would suggest is that constitutional nationalism didn't simply disappear in a puff of smoke with the election of 1918. Sinn Féin was clearly the big political beast in Ireland, but there still was space for nationalist disquiet with the course of events after 1918. So today I want to take a look at the nationalist MPs in Parliament, and also have a look at one former MP who set up a new party in 1919 and wielded some influence over the Prime Minister's office during the drafting of the Government of Ireland Act, and his name was Stephen Gwyn. But let's turn to Westminster first. So, as I've mentioned, there were 7 Irish Party MPs who sat on the benches of the House of Commons between 1918 and 1922. Some of their names will be familiar, such as William Archer Redmond, the son of the former party leader John, Joe Devlin, who became the leader of the party after 1918, and the politically immortal T.P. O'Connor. Their slightly lesser known colleagues included Edward Kelly, who represented Donegal East, Jeremiah McVeigh, the MP for Down South, who's photoed here with the writer Frank McDonough, Patrick Donnelly, the MP for Armagh South, and Thomas Harbinson, who sat for Tyrone North and whose photograph I was unable to find. So along with Devlin as the MP for Belfast West, you'll note the preponderance of northern constituencies amongst the rump of the Irish Party. The majority of the other seats in Ulster were held by Unionists. So given the abstention from Westminster of Sinn Féin, then Irish MPs after 1918, both Unionist and Nationalist, spoke with a decidedly northern twang. The election of 1918 is notable for a number of reasons, but its impact in inflicting a partition of the Irish body politic is sometimes overlooked. So the proposal to partition Ireland into 2 self-governing units came with the Government of Ireland Bill of 1920. At the end of September 1919, the British Cabinet was informed that the Home Rule Act of 1914, which was suspended for the war's duration, would come into force following the ratification of the final peace treaties in Europe. A committee was established under the leadership of the prominent conservative and unionist figure Walter Long to examine all options for Irish policy. The committee was made up of 5 conservatives, 4 liberals, and 1 coalitionist Labour member. The Lord Lieutenant, Lord French, and the Chief Secretary, Ian Macpherson, were also affiliated members. In framing policy ideas, this committee was animated by 2 chief concerns: the continuing unity of the empire and the absence of coercion for Ulster. The Act of 1914 was deemed unviable because of the vagueness of the safeguards for Ulster. The best solution in the eyes of the committee was a 2-parliament Home Rule settlement, creating 1 political jurisdiction within the province of Ulster and another for the rest of the country. So this proposal became the basis of the Government of Ireland Act. The exact definition of Ulster was a matter of dispute, with the coalition government, after lobbying from Northern Unionists, opting for the 6-county unit. The decision to create a Home Rule Parliament in the North seems paradoxical, given the fierce Unionist resistance in the North to the concept, but it was partly taken because of a fear of nationalist opposition to direct rule from Westminster. Given the abuses that occurred under the watch of the Northern Ireland Parliament after 1921, the irony of this position becomes, in retrospect, quite immense. But it is important to understand the rationale of the decisions taken at the time. The 2 new polities, called Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, were given Home Rule status, ensuring that the island possessed self-government across the entire territory, albeit in 2 separate devolved administrations. In addition, a Council of Ireland was put in place, which was designed to promote harmony and the development of mutual interests of what was called Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Indeed, the committee repeated again and again their hope of the eventual unification of Ireland, a sentiment which the coalition government repeated in introducing the proposals as policies in 1920. But while the Government of Ireland Act delivered a form of self-government to Ireland through the creation of 2 devolved administrations, the unreality of the scheme remains extremely striking. As the Government of Ireland Act was becoming law, Sinn Féin was the major political force in Leinster, Munster and Connacht. The IRA were raging an increasingly vicious war against the Crown forces, and Dáil Éireann had done much to undermine the legitimacy of the British state in Ireland, not least through the creation of the Dáil courts, providing the underground Irish government with an effective judicial arm. Elements within the British government were aware that the proposals of the Government of Ireland Act didn't go far enough for most people in the 26-county area, but they were hampered by a seeming lack of options. An independent republic and Dominion Home Rule were ruled out in 1920 because of a perceived threat to imperial unity. It's quite remarkable then that just over 1 year later, in December 1921, the British state agreed to Dominion status for Ireland with an opt-out for Northern Ireland, after negotiations with leading players from Sinn Féin. A long-standing British trope that Irish self-government was fatal to the empire was abandoned at breathtaking speed. To return, however, to the question of partition. The response of Irish MPs to the Government of Ireland Act is often glossed over. This is understandable, perhaps, given their dramatically reduced numbers caused by Sinn Féin's abstentionism, and a general interpretation that ultimately what was important within Irish politics was being played out in Ireland itself. But the observations, protests, and attitudes of Irish MPs is not without interest. The early omens regarding the proposals that would eventually become the Government of Ireland Act were not good. Walter Long's committee did not consult nationalist MPs. At John Dillon's urging, John Dillon, the last Irish Party leader before 1918, John Dillon's urging, the Irish Party boycotted the Prime Minister's speech introducing the committee's resolutions in December 1919. Indeed, Dillon, who was, of course, outside Parliament at this period, losing his seat in 1918, suggested that the Irish nationalist MPs deploy a campaign of silence to combat the proposals. This was partly born from the desperate realization that if the Government of Ireland Bill collapsed, an even more demeaning policy might take its place. Despite Dillon's urging of a form of abstentionism, the Irish Party MPs did speak out against the proposals during 1920. The nationalist case against the proposals was constructed on long-established tropes of Ireland containing one nation, meaning that partition was a brutal denial of full nationhood. During the second reading of the bill, William Archer Redmond conceded that the north of Ireland needed safeguards to realise Irish self-government, but the proposals put forward by the government, in Redmond's words, gives to Ulster a statutory veto upon the further development and progress of our country. The British aspiration for eventual unity was meaningless, Redmond continued, given that there was no inducement for Unionists to work with the Dublin Parliament. Intentions were one thing, but realities were another, and Redmond feared that once a border was drawn, it would be impossible to erase. Joe Devlin's contributions at the second reading stage were unusually pithy. He followed Dillon's advice not to engage in discussion about the Government of Ireland Bill through keynote speeches, preferring instead to interrupt coalition and unionist speakers with barbed comments and questions. Privately, Devlin was extremely concerned about the shift from a 9-county administration in Ulster to a 6-county unit on the grounds that it was a deliberate attempt to consolidate unionist control. He wrote to Bishop O'Donnell that such a scenario would result in, quote, all the sufferings and tyranny of the present day continuing only in worst form. During the summer of 1920, with violence visiting the streets of Belfast on a daily basis, a despairing Devlin denounced what he called the Partition Bill with extreme gusto, earning himself a suspension from the House of Commons for the use of unparliamentary language. He was followed out of the chamber by Irish Party colleagues and members from the Labour benches. Devlin felt politically insignificant and sidelined. Indeed, this sums up the general state of mind within constitutional nationalism at Westminster during this period. T.P. O'Connor wryly commented that during the second reading of the Government of Ireland Bill, that partition and the creation of 2 Home Rule entities in Ireland were likely to become law without a single Irishman voting in their favour. Epoch-defining events were occurring in Ireland and London, which would reverberate for decades and even a century later, but the parliamentary nationalists were reduced to spectators. O'Connor was correct in his prediction. The second reading of the bill was carried by 348 votes to 94, with only coalition parties supporting it. The opposition included the 7 Irish nationalists and the 2 Southern Unionists. The Ulster Unionists abstained from the vote. Now, the position of the Ulster Unionists is worthy of mention, not least because of the reaction it provoked from the nationalist MPs. Sir Edward Carson, the leader of the Ulster Unionists, oscillated between embarrassment to wrath in his contributions to the debate. In March 1920, Carson angrily denounced the proposed deployment of a Home Rule framework as the solution to Ireland's constitutional question. I never believed in Home Rule, Carson told the Commons. I do not believe in it now, and I believe it will be fraught with disaster to your country and to mine. That said, Carson admitted that Unionists were in a dilemma. Failure to accept the Government of Ireland Bill implied a unitary Irish polity dominated by Sinn Féin would come into being. He recognised that the 6 northeastern counties of Ulster, which would become Northern Ireland, stood to win exclusion from a Sinn Féin-dominated southern polity. But this safeguard could only be realised through a 180-degree Unionist turn towards Home Rule. Carson resented the Home Rule inflection of partition more than partition itself, and his reasoning is worth quoting in full. And I give the quote here. And this is what he says. I know that many of my old friends in Ireland will call me a traitor. Why? Because I will not go on and fight to the end. Let me say this. I am offered by this bill a parliament for the 6 counties. Ought I to try and kill a bill that contains a proposal with the Home Rule Act of 1914 upon the statute book? In other words, if I help to kill this bill, I bring into force automatically the Act of 1914. What a nice leader I would be to go up to Belfast and call the people there together and say, look here, you made a covenant, go and get your rifles again and come out and drill and fight. For what? For the 6 counties that are offered a bill which I could have got without fighting at all. No one but a lunatic would undertake such a performance. It was an extraordinary speech which highlighted the tensions within the Unionist family caused by the Government of Ireland Bill. Our longing is to be left alone, lamented Carson. While it was unclear at its origins, the creation of Northern Ireland essentially fulfilled this purpose, although it came at the expense of the community relations in the north. The Nationalist response to Carson's pained interventions was furious. Thomas Harbinson, the MP for North East Tyrone, accused Carson of weeping crocodile tears. The rise of Sinn Féin and partition might have been avoided, Harbinson raged, had Ulster Unionists compromised with John Redmond during the Home Rule crisis before 1914. Harbinson's intervention was also of note for a seeming gaffe that he made on his assault on the principle of partition. Ireland is a nation, one and indivisible, he argued, before going on to say that this House has no moral right or power to divide Ireland. In my humble judgment, no power has any right to divide up a nation except the people of that nation itself. This assertion provoked laughter in the Commons, presumably because many MPs believed this was exactly the crux of the matter. The people of Ireland did, in fact, profoundly disagree on the most suitable polity to govern the island. So the role of Irish MPs at Westminster during the passage of the Government of Ireland Act was reduced to that of a bystander. The government, bolstered by its enormous parliamentary majority, pushed ahead with Long's committee key findings. The Nationalist MPs were not consulted by the committee or the government, and they were silent for parts of the debate. And when they did contribute, it did not affect meaningful change. Of course, the Government of Ireland Act was not the only focus of the parliamentary nationalists during this time. Devlin, in particular, was extremely active in the Commons in publicly condemning the wave of reprisal violence that gripped Ireland in 1920 and 1921, and highlighting the social and economic devastation of the shipyard and other workplace expulsions. And indeed, when the first elections to the Northern Ireland Parliament came about in May 1921, Devlin remains the nationalist figure of most substance in the north. Despite the rise of Sinn Féin and a seeming inability to halt partition, Edmund de Valera felt obliged to negotiate a pact with Devlin ahead of the northern elections. Sinn Féin were unable to break the Constitutional Nationalist grip over parts of Belfast and border counties such as Derry and Fermanagh. In the end, both the Nationalist Party, as the remnants of the Irish Parliamentary Party were now called, and Sinn Féin endured a disappointing campaign, winning only 6 seats apiece to the Northern Parliament. Both parties immediately abstained, leaving the 40 Ulster Unionist members to govern without an opposition. This apparent answer to the Ulster question did not, however, contribute to an inclusive polity in Northern Ireland that worked for all its inhabitants. Now, let's turn to a different constitutional nationalist perspective on partition. Stephen Gwyn was formerly the MP for Galway City between 1906 and 1918. He left the Irish Party in 1918 after John Redmond's death disgusted at John Dillon's more critical stance on Irish involvement during the First World War. And Gwyn had a very personal connection to the war effort. He served on the Western Front twice during the conflict, and the experience profoundly altered his political outlook. Prior to the war, Gwyn, like the vast majority of Irish nationalists, rejected the case for Ulster exceptionalism from a Home Rule settlement. Serving in the trenches alongside Ulstermen in the face of a common enemy, however, dramatically altered his political outlook. The bonds of war prompted him to work more for national reconciliation than national autonomy. He served on the Irish Convention during 1917 and 1918, which brought the Redmondites close to securing a deal with the dwindling band of Southern Unionists. At the election of 1918, he stood unsuccessfully as an independent nationalist for the Dublin University seat. So in 1919, he was entering into a very uncertain political world. In January 1919, several days after the first meeting of Dáil Éireann and the Solo Headbeg ambush, which started in some ways the War of Independence, Gwyn launched the Irish Centre Party. The Centre Party was a small body dominated by professional men and women, several of whom were well known, but mostly with little or no experience of public life. The party's notables included the barrister W.E. Wiley, the academic Charles Oldham, and most prominently the Army General Sir Herbert Gough. Now, Gough was the Brigadier General who had voiced concerns about being sent to suppress Ulster Unionism in 1914 at the height of the Ulster crisis. The Curragh incident, as it has become known, confirmed that the army could not be used to enforce Home Rule in Ulster. Gough headed a body of cavalry officers that announced that they would resign if they were ordered north. The Great War, however, changed Gough's outlook on Irish politics, mirroring Gwyn in some way. After serving in Europe with Gwyn, Willie Redmond, and other nationalists, Gough came to believe that unionism and nationalism in Ireland could be reconciled under a measure of Home Rule. He refused an offer by Sir Edward Carson to stand as an Ulster Unionist MP in the 1918 election. Instead, as Gough announced in a public letter, he was now committed to brotherhood and conciliation in Ireland, which he believed could be achieved through the Centre Party. So, what was the Centre Party all about? Through the Centre Party, Gwyn advanced a federal programme with the creation of a self-governing Ireland within the British Empire. Ireland would gain a central parliament for national affairs and 4 provincial assemblies to tackle local issues. For Gwyn, Ulster was the most significant barrier to the realisation of self-government in Ireland. So the need for 4 provincial assemblies may seem superfluous, but his logic was actually quite clear. He envisaged a federal framework for Ireland's constitutional design as the mean for the provinces to meet on an equal footing, thereby weakening Ulster's sense of difference and fostering an all-island unity. The Centre Party was and remained a small organisation. As Gwyn lamented, his new movement was better off for brains than it was for money. But in March 1919, Gwyn gained the opportunity to reach a mass audience through his appointment as special Irish correspondent of The Observer, the London-based Sunday newspaper. Appearing weekly until the first half of 1925 and more sporadically thereafter, Gwyn's crisply written Observer articles offered piercing commentaries on the subsequent course of politics in Ireland, north and south. The column also gave him a prominence within Irish political life that he otherwise would have lacked. And indeed, when he started working and writing for The Observer, things were not going so well in spreading the Centre Party's message. At a meeting in Newry in March 1919, Gwyn was interrupted during an address which focused on the workings of federalism in the British Dominions, Switzerland, and the United States of America. When challenged about his commitment to the Irish nation, Gwyn responded angrily, "We will never have a nation until we are united, and that is what we are out to accomplish." This declaration led to scenes of disorder, cheers, and cries of "Sit down, John Bull, and Ireland is one and undivided." Gwyn angrily retorted, "She's anything but that. She is totally divided." But the message was lost in the confusion. Gwyn was hauled down and forced to conclude his speech prematurely. Creating a meaningful centrist party during 1919 was a testing experience, and the difficulties that Gwyn encountered may have prompted him to merge the Centre Party with Sir Horace Plunkett's newly formed movement, the Irish Dominion League. Plunkett was the founder and leader of the Irish cooperative movement, and his path had crossed with Gwyn's during the Irish Convention of 1917 to 1918. In launching the Irish Dominion League in June 1919, Plunkett claimed that he had contacts inside the moderate wing of Sinn Féin, from which he believed that a majority within the new nationalism would accept Dominion Home Rule. In other words, a full measure of self-government, but not a republic, and that would encompass the entire island of Ireland. Gwyn warmly greeted Plunkett's ideas, particularly after Plunkett conceded that there would be ample room for provincial rights within an Irish Dominion. Gwyn took that to mean that the idea of a settlement which would give to Ulster what Quebec has in Canada appears to be gaining ground. But this federal analogy was a marked overreading of Plunkett's own position, and indeed the relationship between the two men would rapidly crumble over the issue of partition. So the attempt to reanimate constitutional nationalism through the vehicle of the Dominion League was beset with numerous problems, not least the unwillingness of both the Ulster Unionists and Sinn Féin to engage with ideas of Dominion Home Rule. There was also an upsurge in violence in Ireland from the summer of 1919, with more and more IRA attacks on RIC constables. It was against this backdrop that the government awoke from its inertia over Ireland and pressed ahead with the process that would lead to the Government of Ireland Act. Gwyn's influence can be detected in its rationale as he moved to yet another mode to shore up moderate nationalist politics in Ireland and to try and halt the divisive course of political extremism. So I've already talked about the Government of Ireland Act and how a small band of Irish nationalist MPs at Westminster attempted to oppose partition. But it's worth noting that Gwyn, a former member of the Irish Party, indirectly influenced the assumptions that underpinned the Act. Gwyn had come to believe that the partition of Ireland reflected political realities, and he emerged as the scheme's most vocal supporter from within the wider nationalist family. He was fearful that IRA violence was entrenching the divisions between unionism and nationalism in Ireland. He wrote in The Observer that the excesses of republicanism had, quote, made Ulster's case for them as they never could have made it for themselves. Such thinking was, however, strongly opposed by the Dominion League, which firmly rejected the principle of partition. The League's newspaper, The Irish Statesman, publicly attacked Gwyn's belief that there are two Irelands. But Gwyn remained unrepentant. Towards the end of 1919, he published John Redmond's Last Years, an incredibly insightful, vivid, and critical account of the final phase of the Irish Party from the Third Home Rule Bill of 1912 to Redmond's death in 1918. While the book established Redmond as a totemic figure for Gwyn's own particular post-war brand of pluralistic and conciliatory politics, it did not shy away from what Gwyn believed to be the strategic mistakes made by the Irish Party before the outbreak of war in 1914. Gwyn argued that Redmond's refusal to consider partition as a solution at an earlier stage of the impasse contributed to the downfall of constitutional nationalism in 1918. The striking conclusion was that the Irish Party was not entirely blameless, a form of historical revisionism notably lacking in subsequent accounts that were published by other Redmondites, who tended to point only to external factors in explaining the Irish Party's destruction. Now, around the time of the publication of John Redmond's Last Years in late 1919, Gwyn opened a correspondence with a key member of the British government's inner circle, Lloyd George's private secretary, Philip Kerr. Kerr hoped that moderate politics in Ireland could be rebuilt, thereby undermining Sinn Féin's radicalism. To this end, Gwyn urged Kerr to persuade the Prime Minister to adopt a partitioned Home Rule scheme as the basis for a settlement. Interestingly, Gwyn alerted Kerr to the publication of a new book by the Maynooth scholar Walter MacDonald called Some Ethical Questions of Peace and War, And the picture here is a reissue put out by UCD Press in 1998. In telling Kerr to pass this book on to the Prime Minister, Gwyn noted that it makes the case for partition out of Celtic history. Indeed, Lloyd George took Gwyn's advice and quoted MacDonald's key argument in his speech introducing the Government of Ireland Bill. And this is the quote: "The Protestants of Ulster differ from the majority in the rest of the island, not only in religion, but in race, mentality, culture generally. A minority in Ireland, they are majority in the northeast corner, and therefore, on the principles which we've been advocating, are entitled to home rule." So through Kerr then, Gwyn obtained a line of communication with the Prime Minister, but whether Lloyd George would always listen was, of course, another matter. As we know, Sinn Féin ignored the government's scheme while the Dominion League rejected it. So within nationalist Ireland, Gwyn was wholly isolated on this issue. His support for partition should not be seen as a sudden conversion to unionism or even to a two nations theory. Gwyn believed that partition could be used as the means to create the circumstances for a future unitary settlement. Ulster Unionism, of course, interpreted partition as an end in of itself. Gwyn's stance was unpopular realpolitik in a way, in a time of revolution, a realization that the proposals were simply the best that could be gained from a conservative-dominated coalition. He recognized that Unionist nationalist relations were severely damaged by the pre-war Home Rule crisis, partly due to the Irish Party's unwillingness to concede to Unionist demands. Republican extremism exacerbated and entrenched Irish divisions in the post-war period. In this environment, Irish self-government was imperative to rebuild the centre ground and to find a common unity of purpose amongst moderate men, north and south. In an article for the Manchester Guardian in January 1920, Gwyn argued, with a slight echo of Michael Collins's later defence of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, that the government's proposals could eventually lead to the ultimate freedom that Ireland sought. Gwyn desired as much legislative power as possible in Irish hands, but since a republic was an impossible dream and was deeply repugnant to Ulster Unionism, and the government's lack of interest in conceding Dominion status was politically bankrupting the Dominion League, a revised form of home rule became the logical compromise. The shifts in political positions made by Gwyn throughout 1919, federalism to Dominion status to partition, were not due to a lack of principle, but a realization of the limitations of British statesmanship, Ulster Unionism, and Irish nationalism. As the bill rumbled through Parliament, Gwyn supplied Kerr with information and advice on the Irish situation, which was incorporated into the design of the partition legislation. Aware of the criticisms which the bill was attracting in Ireland, Kerr looked to Gwyn for moral support as the legislative details were being addressed. Gwyn confidently informed Kerr that the bill represented the best way to secure self-government in Ireland. "Nobody likes partition," claimed Gwyn. "But if self-government is to be started, it can only start on a dual basis. The choice made is dictated by a desire to forward Irish unity. Irishmen are more likely to come together if dealing direct with one another and if self-government exists in both Ulster and the rest, i.e. throughout Ireland." Amidst the sobering reality of Irish politics, this was an extremely optimistic view. The great handicap was the lack of domestic support for the scheme in Ireland. Indeed, the Dominion League's newspaper denounced Gwyn's stance, suggesting that he was assenting to the proposition not merely that half a loaf is better than no bread, but half a loaf is better even if it is poisoned. The tone of Gwyn's Observer column became increasingly grave throughout the spring of 1921 as he condemned the cheapening of life through the IRA's targeting of ex-servicemen and the Crown Force's disregard for the safety of civilians. So once more, Gwyn decided that it was time for action. With his focus on the May elections to the new institutions created by the Government of Ireland Act, Gwyn contacted the senior Southern Unionists, Lords Middleton and Oranmore, to gain a hearing for a new political party. "The time has come," Gwyn told the Unionist chiefs, "when moderate men in Ireland of various shades of religious and political belief ought to come together and organise in order to be able to put forward candidates at the coming election for the Parliament in Southern Ireland. Gwyn believed that there was a silent majority who opposed violence in Ireland, and they would rally to this call, but what was needed was leadership. A new centre party with Lord Middleton at its head was the formula that Gwyn promoted. Although Middleton listened sympathetically, he rejected the proposals. Deflated, Gwyn left the meeting with no organisation to contest the elections. A further blow came in March when Kerr stood down as Lloyd George's private secretary, thereby severing Gwyn's informal line to the inner circle of the government. The final political door swung shut for this most Sphinx-like and controversial constitutional nationalist. So just a few words in conclusion. Gwyn's ideal scenario, which was framed while the Government of Ireland Bill was passing through Westminster in 1920, was that if Ireland were given institutions that respected the competing claims of self-determination on the island, moderate men would come forward and guide the northern and southern parliaments towards a unity of purpose. The realities of May 1921, however, were as far removed from this hope as is possible to get. Gwyn lamented the failure of constitutional nationalists to contest the 1921 elections, while acknowledging a climate of fear which had deterred most voters from supporting opposition to republicanism. The violent background was thus, in his reading, a prominent reason in rationalising Sinn Féin's sweep of Southern Ireland, thereby nullifying Gwyn's brand of constitutional nationalism. What such an interpretation disregards, however, is the genuine depth of feeling within all wings of nationalism against the Government of Ireland Act, a fact that Gwyn could not overturn. Travelling through Ireland in April and May 1921, the English journalist Wilfred Ewart failed to find one nationalist who supported the government's plans. Instead, he repeatedly found the call for at least Dominion Home Rule, suggesting that despite Sinn Féin's seemingly doctrinal republicanism, the position throughout the country at large remained more fluid, if much more advanced than Gwyn's. A compromise between British imperialism and Irish nationalism was possible from this vantage point, but not on the basis of the 1920 legislation. So what are we to make then of constitutional nationalism's political activism during the period when partition was implemented? Obviously, this is a story of painful defeat. The remnants of the Irish Party at Westminster could do nothing to shape the government's proposals through 1920. Devlin, Redmond, and the other MPs suffered the ignominy of sitting in a parliament introducing legislation to divide Ireland without possessing any influence over the shape of that legislation. Devlin, who strongly disliked the notion of abstentionism, bemoaned that had Sinn Féin taken their seats at Westminster, the Government of Ireland Act would never have seen light of day. This overlooks several fundamental points, not least Sinn Féin's rationale for abstentionism in the first place. Such a judgment also downplays the stark divide within the Irish body politic, which only deepened during 1916 and 1921. This was the heart of Stephen Gwyn's analysis, and the reason why he conceded reluctantly that partition was the only method by which to bring about self-government in Ireland. His hope for moderation to come to the fore in the north and the south following partition was, however, not realised. Gwyn's political thought was complex, if out of tune amongst his contemporaries. His drive to build bridges was violated by Republican violence, by Unionist inflexibility, and British imprudence. Gwyn's Ireland, based on reconciliation and a mature recognition of diverse political opinions, was therefore lost in the chaos of revolution, and partition became its perennial epitaph. Thank you.
Thanks for excuse me. Thanks very much, Colin. I think we all have our personal crosses to bear. So one of mine is always picking over the ashes of the various election results. So I'll kind of do that now while you gather your thoughts. What I was just wondering is, how do we read the IPP's performance? Now, it's hard to read it like that because not all candidates run under an Irish parliamentary party label, of course, but some run as independents. But I think people know who they are, and some do run as either nationalists or Irish party. How do we feel about how do we analyse the IPP's performance in the 1920 local elections and again in 1921, I suppose, in the north, where, as you said, they're more or less 50-50 with Sinn Féin? I mean, I analyse it in two ways. I think it's pretty clear, particularly with the way Sinn Féin peak in the north in 1921, that there seems to be going back, allowing for the vagaries of the different electoral registers that the elections are held under. There seems to be an ongoing swing towards Sinn Féin, which we can't really analyse now. But I think the 1920 local elections are important because they show, I would say, possibly an increase in support for Sinn Féin in a lot of places, because although they don't appear to do as well as they do in 1918, obviously the franchise is restricted, so they do a lot better among groups they were thought to have done badly in before. And of course, amongst other things, they take the council in Waterford, they take a majority in Louth, and in places where the IPP had done well. Obviously, in other places, then the IPP is obliterated. Even in places where they might expect to do relatively well, like West Roscommon near Ballahadreen, Dillon's hometown, they don't do very well. So just wondering, how would you anticipate that? Would you interpret that? Excuse me. Would you find that there is a constant swing to Sinn Féin? And do you think it maybe peaks in 1921? I've gone on long enough. I have two other kind of sub questions on that, but just go with that.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with anything you just said there, Tommy. I think I would broadly agree with that analysis. I think I'm always slightly surprised when I go back and I look at the local election results that the remnants of the IPP don't do a bit better because of the restrictions in the franchise. So the 1918 general election, you've got universal suffrage for men at least. There's a much more restricted local government franchise, and Sinn Féin do well. And the IPP, they do better than you would have thought. And the IPP can't really muster any kind of comeback. I guess the only thing I would just say to slightly temper that is the northern constituencies do hold out a little bit longer. I suppose because of the strength of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Devlinites up there. There's more of a sense of constitutional nationalist organization, which manages to survive in a way that the United Irish League frankly doesn't. So where you have the AOH, where they are historically strong, I guess you find remnants of the Irish Party and certainly like a.
I'm sorry, just to highlight to viewers that's a category that would include Dundalk, areas where the AOH are strong.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, and there's I think there's a slightly more critical stance on Sinn Féin, and it does take Sinn Féin longer to break those areas down. But at the same time, I think the kind of people who have been talking about, like Gwyn, they are profoundly out of touch with this, switch to Sinn Féin. There are areas of old IPP hotbeds which remain resistant to a degree, but it's very difficult for these isolated individuals to actually mount any kind of political comeback, as we've been talking about the difficulties of organizing a rival nationalist party to take on the might of Sinn Féin. It just seems to be beyond them. I think the problem is that just the remnants of constitutional nationalists they're just too scattered, and they're also just frankly too demoralized as well. But I think it's always important, and I always encourage my students to think about Sinn Féin's grip over Ireland isn't hegemonic. So we have the obvious exceptions of where unionism is winning the northeastern seats of Ulster, but there are these pockets of nationalist resistance to Sinn Féin, which does actually continue up through 1920 and 1921. So it is important to note that actually there's some complexity in Irish nationalist politics at this time.
Yeah, that's true. I think one thing I found researching the 1920 local elections Dublin is that it reminded me actually of the 2011 election and Fianna Fáil, and that certain areas where there's a particularly strong IPP candidate, they tend to have, even where this individual runs as an independent, there tends to be a quite suppressed Sinn Féin vote. So in the wards in Dublin where Alfie Byrne runs, the ward where Alfie Byrne runs, the Sinn Féin vote is way lower than it would be in other similar wards within the city. Obviously, there are other kind of quite unionist wards on the south side of Dublin, which is another discussion entirely. I'm going to keep going on the election results. Of two other questions, some of which are getting into counterfactuals, which we might do at some point for the sake of a chat. But just reading Michael Laffan the other day and his book about Sinn Féin, he pointed out, he actually ignored 1921 in that he pointed out that the Irish Parliamentary Party remained the sole or the uncontested, or he's used some term like that, leaders of Northern nationalism, which he meant in the six counties, until 1969. But I just think that's an interesting aspect of the swing, is that the Sinn Féin vote kind of peaks in 1921, where they're themselves and the IPP are more or less neck and neck within the six counties. And then it seems to dissipate, and the IPP gains the upper hand, and eventually, effectively, I think Sinn Féin supporters start through the National League of the North supporting the IPP. So do you want to, or the remnants of it, do you want to maybe speak to that a little bit? Anything you do know?
So after partition, the state of nationalist politics in Northern Ireland, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Essentially, yeah, that how the IPP kind of maintains its leadership position. I just find it interesting the way Sinn Féin kind of peak at that point in 1921 and then dissipate. I don't know, do you know anything more about that?
Yeah, like it's, to quote a good excuse that historians give, it's kind of outside my period a little bit. But yeah, I can try, because I think it's a really interesting point. And again, like it shows the failure of Sinn Féin to actually break into these northern counties, which historically have been associated with the IPP. So in 1921, when Devlin organizes what's called the Nationalist Party, they are able to tap into that AOH networks around Belfast, border counties, things like that. I guess. So you've got that. So you've got obviously Devlin as the totemic figure, who's incredibly popular amongst nationalists in Belfast and remains so up to his death in 34, I think it is. An incredibly popular and charismatic figure. But also, I suppose it's all about the treaty split, of course, deflects hugely from the North. I guess, like, we'll be familiar with like Colin sending the IRA in the North to try and destabilize the new Northern administration as basically a tactic to deflect from divisions that are caused by the treaty. But like once those treaty divisions really set in, and then you have the emergence of new parties, and the emergence of a 26 county state. I think that the notion of Sinn Féin as a 32 county entity becomes slightly more problematic, because the new parties caused by the treaty split, are, of course, they are associated with the 26 counties, and they take the eye off the ball a little bit. And so that allows, in some ways, I guess, the Devlinites to continue and to increase their support to actually build a genuine nationalist party in Northern Ireland. I guess that must be part of it. Though I do get a disclaimer. I don't really do work beyond 1921, so I'm only I just want to strongly emphasize that those are just my initial thoughts. I would have thought the treaty splits actually plays a huge role in deflecting Sinn Féin attention away from the North. Like it also should be said, like in 1918, like we talk about Ulster being the exception, and of course it is in a way, because the Northeast going solidly unionist. And then you've got like most of the Irish Parliamentary Party seats are in Ulster. But of course, in West Ulster, like Sinn Féin are winning those seats. So it's not like Ulster is Sinn Féin free. Like that is not the case. There is the basis of Sinn Féin, like strong Sinn Féin support that in Ulster that's there. But yeah, it is quite remarkable in how weak as a constitutional party Sinn Féin actually is after partition in 1921. But I leave that more for experts on, northern 20th century Northern Irish history, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I just had one slightly cynical thought on that, which would be that because the one side of the treaty split and then the other takes power in the south, there are jobs available if you're a leading Sinn Féiner in the north and you move south. So there may be a lack of leadership there as well.
Yeah, indeed, that's true. Well, that's actually a really valid point, of course, because like the likes of Ernest Blythe, like people who should be leading the charge in the north, if you're going to think of it like that, of course, they end up in the 26th county entity. So yeah, that's a really good point.
A question in from Felix Larkin. At the end of 1919, the IPP loses control of the Freeman's Journal, their long-time party organ. Is this a factor in the continuing loss of support for the IPP in 1920? Cites the local government elections. It's a really good point, Felix. Thanks.
It is, yeah. And, Felix, of course, knows a lot more about that than anybody here, I would say. I guess yes. But I would say it's probably more symbolically important that they've lost control of the Freemans. I think the tide of nationalism has changed fundamentally against them, and it's very difficult to mount a comeback. Even if the Freemans was well organized and propagating on behalf of the IPP, I just think there's frankly just too much water under the bridge by the time you get to that point. I have seen people, I think I might have even said it myself in my book, the loss of control of the Freemans is a really symbolic moment because it's yet another nail in the coffin, but it's not the final nail, but it's not the first nail either. But it's important, but maybe not practically important, if that makes sense. But again, Felix, you probably you do know much more about that than I do.
That's I think Felix may have forgotten more about that than we know.
Yeah, indeed.
We have a question from Pat McDade in Drogheda. Nationalist Richard Hazelton was just 255 votes shy of Sinn Féin in Louth in 1918. Did he sink without trace after that? I'm
afraid I have no idea. I
actually do have an idea because yesterday we had Brian Walker of formerly of Queen's on a chat, and Brian is actually related to Richard Hazelton. And he said that Richard Hazelton subsequently became a trade. He was just saying he had a local connection, and that Richard Hazelton subsequently became a trade unionist in Britain after this.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, excellent. Well, that's good. I'm glad Brian came on before I did, so we can actually have an answer to the question.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah, I think as well as I've done some research on this for Louth County Council, and it'll be put up on the website soon enough. But one thing I found was interesting is that Sinn Féin scored heavily in, judging by the reports in the local papers, Sinn Féin polled very heavily in the Cooley Peninsula, which had been an old Healyite strength in the old North Louth constituency, and also polled very heavily in Louth and the very south, the southern tip of the county, and then actually across the main bulk of or South Louth and the southern tip of the county, and across the main bulk of the county, actually the Irish Parliamentary Party was probably holding firm. And I think that was interesting what you said about the AOH, because it's obvious from the local papers, and you see reports on meetings and reports on openings of new halls and everything, that the AOH is still very strong after the Great War in Dundalk, which is interesting in itself. Just as well, I mean, one thing I think about the newspaper, since Felix brought up the Freeman's Journal, is one thing I think that maybe distorts our view, and I think maybe is promoted, I don't know if it's quite the right word, but it promotes the IPP criticisms of the Republican campaign in a way which jars with the election results, both in 1920, in 1921, and I'd argue in terms of how former Sinn Féiners and former IRA men continually get elected in independent Ireland over the succeeding half a century. It's a bit of an interesting evidence. But one thing I noticed is that a lot of the newspapers are controlled by the old IPP establishment, and they they're not shy about criticizing Sinn Féin in an ongoing way. And I wonder how that, do you have any thoughts on that, and how that maybe interacts with the kind of the more elite figures you were talking about in terms of the Dominion League?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I haven't really thought about newspapers in this period for a long time. So I'm just going through my memory here. Like, I guess, like the obvious example of the Freedmen's Journal comes to mind, and its collapse, as I've said, kind of like symbolic of constitutional nationalism. I must admit, I am very rusty in thinking about old IPP hands into independent Ireland. I like actually having control over various newspapers. So
I mean, the two I'm thinking of here are T.F. McGahan in the Dundalk Democrat, and the defeated candidate in South, Roscommon, who lost to Harry Boland, whose name has just departed my head at the wrong moment, who also controlled the Roscommon Messenger and another newspaper in Mullingar. And I think there was another old IPP supporter who was in charge of the Drogheda Independent around this time as well. And it's just noticeable that them, and I actually think as well, you could argue in terms of some respects the hierarchy, all kind of bring their fairly strong IPP perspective to their criticisms of the, say the Lenten pastorals in 1921, so to their criticisms of what's going on in 1921.
Yeah, and like often forget that the IPP, that like under the Parnellite Party, like this is the party of journalists. And we shouldn't be surprised at the connection between the old party and that kind of business. And there's a certain kind, there's a strong connection which remains throughout, and so it's unsurprising that continues to some ways after the collapse of the Irish Party. You still have that lingering kind of constitutional nationalist presence that is there in the newspaper trade, simply because of that association between home rule and journalism, which is really striking. Obviously in the Parnellite period more so, but like you still have journalists that are there in the Redmondite period as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, it would be interesting to know how many leading journalists were not, say, members of local councils or things, even if they're not appearing at the very top as MPs. As anyone, that's a question from my dad. Has anyone researched the political bias of the local press across the country in that area? I haven't really researched it. I haven't researched it anyway. I have given out about it as I just kind of did in that question, but I haven't really researched it. It's the other, I would say it's possibly under researched in that you often see condemnations from the local press used as a way to question either the legitimacy or the levels of support that were that republicanism had at the time.
So I see the question popping up there, and your dad mentioning only knows about the newsletter. Like, the interesting thing about the Belfast press is like there is a range of unionist newspapers, and again, so like you sometimes think of Sinn Féin as hegemonic, and then you find all kinds of problems to that. But we also think of unionism and Austro-Unionism after 1921 as hegemonic, and in a way, like the party is driven by the need to maintain unity. And like once you bear that in mind, and they talk about unity and turning every election into a border poll, basically, from 1921 on, basically onwards to the current day. But then it's really striking that like during that period of James Craig unity, everything is it's all about the Ulster-Unionist Party. Like there are a range of unionist dailies, like what is it called? The Northern Whig is still being published in Belfast at the same time as the newsletter. And both newspapers can be critical of the Ulster-Unionist Party during the time. So there is more there is diversity in Ulster-Unionism when you go looking for it. So like the party leader saying one thing about unity, and it looks hegemonic from the outside looking in, but you can find dissenting voices through those kind of local press, both like at the Belfast Daily level, but even I hasten to use the word, but like provincial newspapers outside of Belfast, like you still like, which are unionist leaning, but don't necessarily fully back the program of the Ulster-Unionist Party in government. So I think there's still a lot to be said for doing work on local newspapers, thinking about political bias, thinking about how it interacts with the message that the parties actually want to give out. So unity, but yet here's a unionist party criticizing them, things like that.
I think there was a book on local newspapers in the revolutionary period recently enough, but I think we're still waiting for a hardback or an ebook to be published. I think it's still, but it's so I haven't read it, but it looks interesting. But I think that's true. I think also it's probably worth I think it's worth noticing that I don't actually know what the attitude of the Clare Champion was. I do know that there are various examples where that people do support Sinn Féin, but I think there are, as I said, there is a disproportionate number of journalists seem to be clinging to the Irish Parliamentary Party line, which, as you described, as the party of journalists, is really a point worth making. The other,
just one more thing, and that, Tommy, like the work that comes to my mind is like the great work done, like I guess 15 years ago now, by Mike Wheatley and people like that, like looking at again, I don't really like the term, but provincial newspapers. So looking at county, like newspapers at a county level, and taking 4 or 5 counties and actually doing quite a sustained, I guess, discourse analysis, the kind of stuff they're saying. And Wheatley's argument was that the provincial press was much more radical and advanced than the Irish Party was under Redmond. So Redmond would be talking about this, pro-imperialist reconciliation, this kind of stuff, whereas the press in Clare would be talking about the need for a new land war, stuff like this. It'd be much more advanced. I'm not that familiar. I'm not sure if work has been done that press beyond partition and the creation of basically the 2 entities in Ireland after 1921, so Northern Ireland and the Free State. Like what actually
Felix knows.
Probably. I'd say almost definitely knows. But it's funny. It's that thing of, I always associate that kind of newspaper work with the Home Rule period, and I haven't seen that much. And I know it is there, and obviously scholars of post 1921 Ireland do newspapers, but you don't tend to come across as much of that. That's the focus of the research itself, basically the newspapers and their attitudes and how they're shaping public opinion and all of that kind of stuff after 1921. So it'd be really great to see that kind of stuff, like as a sequel to Mike Wheatley's work, take the period beyond 1918, go into the 20s and the 30s and things like that.
Yeah, and Fergus Campbell's work as well.
Yeah.
On
the West.
I think Mike Wheatley's chapter on Roscommon was really useful for me when I studied Roscommon for my PhD for the later period. The other question I have, I just one final thing I'd point out, and that is there was a really interesting book on public opinion during the Great War in Britain and Ireland by Katrina Pennell, where Katrina Pennell pointed out that the market forces may be determined that newspapers, there was a limit to the extent to which newspapers would challenge the values of their readership, because the readers would stop go to somebody else. So, which I think was an interesting point. But actually, my own question I have is the point, does the fact that there's so many IPP supporting journalists during the Irish War of Independence mean that that's a bit of an exception to that? I know it's probably not something we can answer now. But I'm going to give you another, it's almost a what-if question now, but it did manage to get an article in Irish Historical Studies. So we regard it as legitimate. So, and it's to do with the Dominion League to a degree. And actually, I think, if our memory serves, other some newspaper sources are cited as well. But Paul Bew's point that the War of Independence was ultimately pointless because an Irish leadership that had looked for a Dominion settlement in 1920 would have, which is before the overwhelm, 80%. I know people talk about the War of Independence starting in 1919. Some other people like Peter Hart, and indeed myself, would say it's January 1920, the attack, the first deliberate attacks on RIC stations. But whatever else, I think there was some discussion before the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act in August 1920 of Dominion Home Rule, and these discussions around the Dominion League. To what extent do you agree with Bew's point that the War of Independence was pointless? Do you think that there was, if everyone had united, if hypothetically Sinn Féin had adopted Dominion Home Rule as a policy, and united everyone behind them in August of 1920, say that would have that was a runner, and the subsequent violence was all pointless, or any thoughts on that?
So not a controversial question at all.
No, not a controversial question at all.
Well, okay, so I'm familiar with that Bew piece because I think he also talks about counterfactuals being a pointless parlor game. So I could cite that and opt out of it, but I think it's a really good point. And of course, we'll never know, because one path was taken and the other one wasn't. So we'll never know. But I think it is interesting to speculate on these things. I guess, like, the one thing I would say, like doing my own research on Gwyn and the Dominion League and all of those kind of ruminations of constitutional nationalism during 1919 and 1920, I think it becomes pretty clear that they are out of touch. Like Gwyn is, in particular, is out of touch in advocating partition. It's basically a toxic thing for a former Irish Party MP to basically be saying that we should own up. We should basically own partition and try to make the settlement work as best we can, with the aim of fostering eventual unity. And which you know, I understand the logic of his argument, but it just will not fit in the political mood of the time, and that's I just think undeniable. I think the Dominion League is more interesting in a way, because the Dominion, I say Gwyn is more interesting because he's difficult. The Dominion League is interesting because they do seem to be actually a little more tuned in to the need to keep public opinion on their side. So they're very strongly anti-partitionist. So we want Dominion home rule. So we're happy to be part of the empire within, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But it's a unitary state. There is no question of partition here. And you do have, like, you find references to English journalists going through Ireland in 1920, 1921, and they're writing, actually, there is some support for this idea of Dominion home rule. People, frankly, don't see the difference between Dominion home rule and the fully fledged republic that Sinn Féin are arguing for. I think there is something to the argument that if an offer of Dominion home rule, if that was offered in 1920, what would Sinn Féin have done, I guess, is an interesting counterfactual. The problem with it, and the problem with Bew's argument, I think, fundamentally, is that it was never going to happen. There was never going to be an offer of Dominion status in 1921, and this is the great problem. So Dominion status is essentially offered in 1921. It seems to be implausible 1 year before that the British would actually offer this. I think it fundamentally, it does have to come down to this spiraling violence takes its toll on the British state's determination to basically try and retain control over the south of Ireland at this point. And I think that's the fundamental thing. It's interesting. British policy does turn 180 degrees. They're ruling out Dominion status in 1920. They said we can't do this. We just cannot do this. And they do it. They accept it 1 year later, whenever the negotiations are happening with Sinn Féin. So you could make the argument, and it would make sense to me, that the only reason why Sinn Féin are there at the negotiating table is because of the War of Independence. I think it's difficult to get around that. The history of British-Irish relations when it comes to trying to secure self-government is, of course, an incredibly difficult one. So the Parnellite parties, the Redmondite parties, even Isaac Butt's party in 1874, they had the majority of Irish MPs. They argued for home rule, but home rule was never delivered. So it doesn't surprise me that that Sinn Féin have the majority of Irish MPs after 1918, but yet their aims, they seem undeliverable because the British government believed that it would be unsustainable to grant this. In the same way that the British governments struggled with the concept of home rule because they believed it fatal to the unity of the empire. So it doesn't surprise me that that's the same stance taken in 1919, 1920. It then becomes really surprising they do grant it in 1921. So I think the interesting shift that happens, it's not necessarily Sinn Féin saying, or the pro-treatyites anyway, saying we will accept Dominion status instead of republic. The really interesting thing in a way is the British saying, actually, we will offer you Dominion status, and like the whole 50 years of tropes about Irish self-government being fatal to the empire disappear overnight, and it goes like it's a whimper rather than a bang, really. And I think that's the interesting thing to actually look at. The shifts in British policy are really quite profound, and they happen very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's something I'd agree with as well. I think, I can't remember if this is cited by Bew, but there was a line in the Tom Jones diary, where they're talking about Dominion Home Rule. I think it's July 1920, which is one of the reasons. But I think what a lot of people are missing, and you maybe not, it's not necessarily what I don't entirely sure what the Dominion League are asking for. So you might help me out with a comment on that when I've finished waffling. But I think what people miss when they see the talk of Dominion Home Rule, and you see this in you see that in the Dundalk Democrat regularly. You see the mention of Dominion Home Rule as basically the IPP policy. You see the editorial saying, grant us Dominion Home Rule now and stop all this Sinn Féin nonsense dead and all of this kind of thing. But I think people miss is that when Lloyd George is often talking about granting home rule to the empire, even people who are asking, one of the things Lloyd George objects to is granting Ireland an army, and that's, I think, what people the word dominion does a lot of heavy lifting, so people automatically assume that the dominion being offered is what the Irish Free State becomes. And I kind of make a point in terms of people might be familiar with is that's maybe what Michael Collins is referring to in his freedom to achieve freedom, is that once they're granted an army, it's going to be very hard for the British to reoccupy Ireland or to change things. So I don't know if you have any further comments.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And again, like the interesting thing during the 20s is just how the pro-treatyites and then Fianna Fáil after 1926 and 32 when they come into power, how they dismantle the Dominion basically, and they do it quite quickly, and they do it quietly, and there's actually not that much resistance from the British side. The British basically have just moved on. Like there is no Irish question anymore. And so, obviously this causes a problem in Northern Ireland because this is devolution within the Union, and it's not actually been effectively policed by Northern Ireland. So Northern Irish affairs rarely get a hearing at Westminster from 1921 up to 1968, when you have the outbreak of the civil rights disorder, which leads on to the Troubles. So I think, I think it's an interesting one, because the British make such a beef about we can't grant Dominion status in 1920 because it would be fatal to the empire. We're dealing with all these problems throughout the empire. They're dealing with unrest in Egypt and other places, and it's very difficult. They don't want to set this precedent, but then they do a year later, and then very quickly, like the British elements, the Dominion elements, are basically dismantled, like very quietly. And I just find that really striking. So like to go back to Bew's kind of what if, was the War of Independence needed? You could argue that the Civil War wasn't needed because the Dominion status that was granted in 1921 under the terms of the treaty actually was dismantled largely peacefully, just to be slightly controversial.
Yeah. Okay, throw that one in. Hopefully there are no Fianna Fáil ministers watching, and that could be the only gone for another year. The last
I take full responsibility for everything I say, I should say.
Yeah. Well, the last one, I suppose, since we did one what if, we want to kind of go into another, which is one that comes up regularly. One I have to say that I'm not hugely sympathetic to, but one it refers to abstentionism. So, and it's come up recently, I think, because of parallels with the Brexit negotiations and discussions about Sinn Féin abstentionism at that point, and obviously the arithmetic within Westminster in 2017, etc. But the point is, I think that people claim that actually, as this Government of Ireland Act was being formulated by the Long Committee and then negotiated its way through the House, both houses of Parliament in Westminster, there were no Irish MPs, there were very few Irish MPs there to object, because the Sinn Féin MPs were boycotting and were in the Dáil. I just wonder what you think of that. I mean, and people say that may have affected Partition. Now, I'm going to throw my cards on the table here while you formulate an answer. That I'm quite unsympathetic to this for numerous reasons, but I'll give two. I mean, if the face-to-face negotiations in London in July 1914, the Buckingham Palace Conference and the subsequent meetings in Downing Street, and the treaty negotiations in 100 years ago this month couldn't solve partition, I'm not sure what Sinn Féin MPs in Westminster could have done. I would say, in actual fact, even getting the Boundary Commission probably suggests that Griffith's policy of boycotting and of not participating as a constituent element of the United Kingdom, but insisting that you're separate and then engaging in bilateral negotiations is a better policy, or at very worst, an equally unsuccessful policy. So what do you think of both the counterfactual itself and my own thoughts?
I'm in full agreement with you, which might disappoint the audience, but I fully agree. So Devlin talks about, had the Sinn Féin MPs actually been here, we could have actually, this would be different. We wouldn't actually have to suffer the Government of Ireland Act. We could have changed this. And I never really bought that argument. It's basically like it's blaming Sinn Féin for something that's going to happen anyway. You could make the argument that had Sinn Féin taken their seats, although this is a bit far-fetched given the rationale for abstentionism, but had they taken their seats, the Government of Ireland Act, a version of that was going to happen anyway, and they only number 70 or 80, whatever it actually is. I can't remember the figure at the top of my head, and they will be outvoted as the Home Rulers always were historically. Going back to the party of Isaac Butt, frankly doesn't matter. You're always going to be in that permanent minority. This legislation, if the government really want to press it, this is going to happen, and it would have been really politically damaging for Sinn Féin in a way, because they were like, what was the point of us coming to Westminster? So I never really bought this argument that Devlin was putting out, and I have heard, and I remember that stuff during the almost hung Parliament of 27. No, it was a hung Parliament in 2017 in the UK, when this argument that Sinn Féiners should take their seats so they could actually, vote down the government and things like that. But I think it just fundamentally misses the point of why Sinn Féin are abstaining from the first place. And also, I just don't think, particularly in the case of 1919, 1920, 1921, I don't think it would have fundamentally changed that much. Frankly, it doesn't matter if there's 7 Irish MPs or 80 Irish MPs. If the government wanted to push this program, they could have. The optics would have looked worse for them, because if their failure to consult the 7 Irish MPs, if they failed to consult 80 Irish MPs, that would look pretty bad. But I'm not entirely convinced that Lloyd George really cared about the optics of these things. So I frankly don't think it would have changed anything. And if anything, it would have damaged Sinn Féin, I think. And I'm not sure what would have happened after that. Well, it would have been a fatal bit of damage. I'm not 100% sure, but they would be tainted in some ways by this thing that has happened, despite their seeming strength in Ireland. This act is still being foisted onto Ireland.
Okay, interesting. And on that note of concord, probably finish up. So just thanks very much for joining us. I think that was a really illuminating lecture. Some very interesting points in the questions and answers there as well. Thanks to people who posted questions and people who added bits of information, such as Felix and Pat McDade. And thanks to Ian Dalton for coming as well. And thanks also to the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media for funding the Border 100 Symposium. So thanks, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas, so much. And thanks, everybody in the audience, for listening to me drone on. Much appreciated. Thank you.